There was an old radio station outside the small town of Raven Creek in the U.S. state of Montana. It was called WCR 313. It was shut down forever after a terrible accident about 30 years ago. According to official records, the entire station was destroyed by fire, but the townspeople still said that the real truth was something else. They believed that on a certain night every year, at exactly 3:13 a.m., the radio station would automatically restart. At that time, voices that did not belong to living people would be broadcast from there. Most people considered these things to be just rumors. But Ethan Carter was not like that. Ethan was a famous horror podcaster. He would go to mysterious places in America, research them, and tell his stories to the world. He had millions of listeners, but he only believed those stories that had some evidence behind them. One night, a strange message arrived in his email. Subject: Don't listen at 3:13.
It was just an audio file.
The sender of the file was not named. Ethan put on his headphones and played the audio. At first, there was only a faint noise, like an old radio with a bad signal. Then suddenly, a man's panicked voice was heard. "If you hear this voice, don't come. He's watching us." After a few moments, Ethan's hands began to tremble, because the voice was not someone else's. It was his own. He immediately played the audio again. Every word, every breath, every gesture, everything was his. But he remembered that he had never made a recording like this before. At that moment, another voice came at the end of the audio. An old man spoke in a low voice. "There are 7 days left." And the file ended. Ethan couldn't sleep all night. The next morning, he began examining the audio. The information in the file revealed only one thing. Location: WCR 313 radio station, Raven Creek, Montana. This was the closed radio station whose stories he had heard for years. Ethan decided to go there himself. 2 days later, he arrived in Montana with his camera, recorder, and essential supplies in his car. The city was very quiet. There were a few people on the streets, but every time he mentioned the name of the radio station, people immediately changed the subject. Finally, an old shopkeeper said softly, "If you go there tonight, you might not come back." Ethan smiled and asked, "Why did you say that?" Instead of answering, the old man just looked at his watch. "Leave before 3:13 p.m. If you hear a sound, don't answer." With that, he fell silent. Before dusk, Ethan reached the old radio station through the woods. The building was dilapidated. The windows were missing. The walls were rusted. It looked as if no one had been here for decades. He entered. There was dust everywhere. The old microphones, broken chairs, and rusty machines were still in their places. Suddenly, his recorder turned on automatically, even though he hadn't even touched it. At that moment, a faint radio frequency sound began to echo throughout the room. SHHHHHHHHH. Ethan looked around in surprise. All the machines were off. Still, the sound was growing louder. He checked his watch. 3:12 a.m. Only a minute remained. Suddenly, an old microphone automatically turned on. Its red light flashed. Then a voice came from the speaker. "Ethan." He was startled. The voice was crystal clear. "We've been waiting for you." His heart started beating fast. He looked back. The room was empty, but the same voice came from the speaker again. "Don't look back." A cold shiver ran through Ethan's body, because he had already looked back. And there, in the darkness, someone was standing. Ethan's breath caught. In the far corner of the room, a tall, human-like shadow stood silently in the darkness. His face was not clearly visible, but it felt as if he was constantly looking at Ethan. For a moment, the entire room was completely silent. Then suddenly the same voice was heard from the speaker again. "You looked back. Now he can see you too." Ethan immediately shone his flashlight on the shadow. As soon as the light came on, there was nothing there, just a blank wall. "It was my illusion," he said to himself, but his voice lacked confidence. At that moment, the recorder in his hand automatically started to make a sound. Recording started. Ethan tried to turn off the recorder in surprise, but none of the buttons were working. A few seconds later, the sound of footsteps began to be recorded in the recorder. Knock, knock, knock. But the strange thing was that Ethan was standing in his place. Those footsteps belonged to someone else. He slowly turned his neck. The entire hall was empty. Only dust was flying. But the sound of footsteps was constantly getting closer, as if someone was circling around him. Suddenly, the temperature of the room dropped significantly. Fog began to come out of his breath. Then an old chair placed in front of him started to move on its own. Chirr, chirr. The chair was slowly swinging. There was no one in the room, yet it was as if someone was sitting on it. Ethan turned on his camera with trembling hands. I am inside the WCR 313 radio station right now. Something is happening here that I don't understand any scientific reason for. He pointed the camera at the chair, but the chair on the camera screen was not empty. There sat an old man. White hair, an old coat, and dark eyes. Ethan immediately looked at the chair with his own eyes. The chair was empty. He looked at the camera again. The old man was still sitting there, and this time he was smiling. Ethan nervously lowered the camera. When he looked at the screen again, the old man had disappeared. Sweat broke out on his forehead. What the hell is going on? At that moment, the old radio signal began to echo throughout the station. SHHHHHHHHH. Then a clear voice was heard. Welcome to today's broadcast. It was the voice of a radio host. We have a new guest with us today. There was a moment of silence. Then the voice spoke. Ethan Carter. The flashlight almost fell from Ethan's hand. Please step in front of the microphone. He tried to back away. But suddenly, the microphone started to move towards him on its own. The iron stand scraped against the floor and stopped right in front of him. The red light came on again. Record your last message. A whisper came from the speaker. Because in the next broadcast, your voice will be broadcast. Ethan pushed the microphone with all his strength. He fell to the ground. At that moment, the lights in the entire room came on at once. Even though the building had been without electricity for years, old radios, microphones, and machines everywhere started to turn on automatically. Dozens of voices began to echo at once. Someone's screams, someone's prayers, someone's crying, and in the midst of all of them, the same phrase was heard over and over again. We're still here. Ethan put his hands over his ears, but the voices were echoing inside his mind. Suddenly, a door opened on its own. Behind it was a narrow staircase leading down. Somewhere in the darkness, a yellow light bulb was burning. On the wall next to the stairs, there was just one sentence written in red. On air room. And below it, someone had written in blood. Don't go back, he's down. Ethan stood still for a few moments. He should have run back to the car. But as a journalist, his curiosity was greater than his fear. He took a deep breath. He gripped the flashlight tightly and slowly started to descend the stairs. He had only gone down 10 steps when the door at the top,
Bang!
it slammed shut. He ran and tried to open the door, but it was locked from the outside. Now he was trapped in the basement. At that moment, a very low voice was heard from within the darkness. Finally, someone alive has reached here. Ethan held up the flashlight. An old radio appeared in the light, and right behind it, 2 white eyes slowly opened. Ethan's heart started beating fast. He kept the flashlight focused on those white eyes, but after a few moments, those eyes slowly began to disappear, as if the darkness was swallowing them up. Who's there? Ethan asked, daring himself. There was silence for a few seconds. Then the same low voice was heard. If you want to live, then turn off your flashlight. Ethan was stunned. He didn't know whether to believe the voice or not. But at that moment, the sound of someone running came from the other side of the basement. Knock, knock, knock. The sound was coming towards him quickly. Panicked, Ethan immediately turned off the flashlight. The darkness was complete. Only his rapid breathing could be heard. After a few moments, the footsteps suddenly stopped. Then someone whispered very close to him. He hasn't seen you yet. Ethan tried to back away in shock, but his foot hit something. He fell to the ground. His hands hit an old wooden box. He slowly turned on the flashlight again. In front of him sat an old man. A long white beard, shabby clothes, and a deep look of fear on his face. But it was the same man Ethan had seen on the camera screen before. My name is Samuel. the old man said softly. I am the last engineer of this radio station. Ethan's eyes widened in surprise. That's impossible. According to the records, everyone who worked here died 30 years ago. The old man smiled slightly. Yes, that's what the world thinks. Then you? I'm alive, but not completely free. Samuel pointed to the old radio in front of him. This radio doesn't just broadcast sounds. It also imprisons souls. Ethan listened silently. Samuel took a deep breath. In 1989, a secret experiment was being conducted here. Scientists believed that a specific radio frequency could preserve a person's memory and voice forever. At first, everything was fine. Then one night, at 3:13, we turned on a frequency that was not intended for humans. And then, the old man's voice began to tremble. The door to another world opened. A cold breeze suddenly blew through the basement. The old radio turned on automatically. A girl's voice came out of it. Mom, I have to go home. Then a man shouted, close the door. In the next moment, dozens of voices began to echo together. Samuel immediately turned off the radio. Silence fell. All these people, Ethan asked. These are the ones who entered the station but never came back. Ethan's hands went cold. So are they all dead? Samuel shook his head. Some are dead. And some still waiting to die. Suddenly, an old speaker mounted on the basement wall started playing automatically. A woman's voice was heard. The broadcast is about to resume. Then a man spoke. All listeners, take your seats. Samuel's face flushed. No. Time is up. He's awake.
Who?
Ethan asked anxiously. The old man pointed to the last door of the basement with a trembling hand. The broadcaster? He's the real owner of this place. At that moment, the door slowly creaked open. It was completely dark inside, but in that darkness, the sound of someone's footsteps could be clearly heard. Knock, knock, knock. The entire floor shook with each step. Suddenly, a familiar voice rang out from the radio. Ethan. He was startled.
It was his own voice again.
If you're hearing this, then don't run. Because as far as I ran, he was already there. The next moment, a long black shadow stepped out of the door. His body was human-like, but instead of a face, he had only an old radio attached. The radio was making a constant noise. SHHHHHHHHH. Then, from inside the radio, hundreds of human voices began to scream at once. Samuel shouted in fear. Run, Ethan.
Now.
Ethan turned and started running with all his might. But after a few steps, he realized that the path to the basement, the way he had come, was no longer there. Ethan looked around in panic. The staircase he had climbed into the basement a few moments earlier had disappeared. In its place was only a cold, damp wall, as if there had never been a path there. How is this possible? Ethan gasped. Samuel grabbed his arm. This place changes every night. Even the walls here are alive. If the broadcaster wakes up, the paths change automatically. The same heavy footsteps were approaching from behind. Knock, knock, knock. The floor began to shake with each step. Samuel said quickly, Come with me. The two of them ran towards a narrow corridor. The walls of the corridor were covered with old photographs. In each photo, the radio station staff was standing, but there was one strange thing. In each photo, a person's face was blacked out. Ethan paused.
Who is this?
Samuel lowered his eyes. That broadcaster. Was he human before? Yes. His real name was Jacob Harper. He was the famous radio host of this station. His voice was heard all over Montana. Samuel's voice began to fill. But on the night of 1989, when the forbidden frequency was turned on, he was the first to be affected. His voice changed, then his face, and then he was no longer human. At that moment, a booming voice came from behind. Samuel. The old man immediately fell silent. The voice came again. You brought another guest? All the lights in the hallway began to flicker on and off at once. Tick, tick, tick. Every time the light went out, it felt like someone was getting closer to them. Suddenly, the last bulb went out. Complete darkness. Ethan turned on the flashlight with trembling hands. The light fell in front of him, and his blood froze. The people in all the pictures in the corridor were now looking at him. A few moments ago, their faces had been straight. Now, everyone's eyes were only on Ethan. In one picture, a little girl slowly placed her hand on the glass. Then, she started to play with the glass from the inside. Knock, knock, knock. Get us out. Ethan looked away in panic. What is all this? Samuel said. These aren't pictures. These are imprisoned people. Whoever dies here, the broadcaster captures their soul in their broadcast. At that moment, the glass of one of the pictures shattered with a loud bang. A black hand came out, then another. In a few seconds, a blurry humanoid figure emerged from the picture. Its eyes were white. Its face was lifeless. It slowly began to move towards Ethan. Samuel took a small silver pendant from his pocket and threw it at the figure. As the pendant fell to the ground, a bright light spread. The black figure screamed in pain and was pulled back into the picture. As the light faded, the corridor fell silent again. Ethan asked in surprise, "What was that?" "It was the last sign of safety," Samuel replied. "And now, we have nothing left." The two of them began to move forward again. After a while, the corridor ended. In front was a large iron door, rusted. There were only 2 words written on it: Archive Room. Samuel opened the door slowly. Inside were thousands of old audio tapes, recordings, and files. In the middle of the room was an old table on which was only one cassette. It was written in black marker. Ethan Carter. Ethan's step stopped. "This my name?" He picked up the cassette with trembling hands. The date was written below. October 18th, 2026. Ethan was shocked. That date was only 7 days away. "This is impossible," Samuel said slowly. "Here, the last voice of every human being is already recorded." Ethan immediately played the tape in the cassette player. There was a few seconds of noise. Then, his own voice emerged. But this time he was crying badly. "If anyone is listening to this recording, then please, don't open that door. I've set him free." Suddenly, a terrible scream was heard in the recording. Then silence. And finally, a low whisper. "He's standing behind you." The cassette fell from Ethan's hand. He slowly turned his head. Samuel wasn't there. The entire room was empty. Only a long black shadow. A few steps away, standing silently, watching him. And then, a clear voice came from the shadow's radio-like face for the first time. "Let's start broadcasting, Ethan. Let's start broadcasting, Ethan." These words echoed throughout the room. Ethan's footsteps seemed to sink into the ground. The black figure standing in front of him slowly moved towards him. His face was still like an old radio, from which a constant low-frequency sound was coming out. SHHHHH. Then suddenly the radio began to clear. And after one of them, a different sound began to be heard. A woman was crying, "Save my son." Then a man screamed, "I'm still alive." Then a child's voice came, "Mommy, I'm scared." Ethan covered his ears, but the sounds continued to echo in his mind. The broadcaster stopped a few steps away. He slowly extended his hand towards Ethan. At that moment, everything began to change before Ethan's eyes. The room disappeared. The archive room was now a bright radio studio. The walls were new. All the machines were running. Several people were busy with their work. Ethan was surprised. "What is this?" Suddenly, someone called from behind. "Jacob, we're going live in 5 minutes." Ethan turned around and looked. A handsome, smiling young man stood in front of him. He had headphones around his neck. His nameplate was on the table. Jacob Harper. Ethan understood. He was seeing the past. Jacob was a cheerful person. He was the most popular radio host on the station. He would joke with people, sing songs, and broadcast programs late into the night. Then a scientist entered the studio. His name was Dr. Alan Morgan. He told Jacob, "Tonight we'll try a new frequency." Jacob laughed and said, "Just be careful not to scare the audience away." The doctor smiled, but there was a strange anxiety in his eyes. The experiment began at exactly 3:13 a.m. A large machine was turned on. Strange waves began to form on the screen. At first, everything was normal. Then, suddenly, all the machines started beeping loudly at once. The lights in the room started to flicker. A voice came from the radio speaker that didn't belong to a human. "We've heard your voice." Jacob was frightened and moved away from the microphone. But the microphone started moving towards him automatically. Then black smoke came out of the machine and entered Jacob's body. He started screaming in pain. His voice started to change. His face started to turn black. And a few moments later, the same Jacob had become a broadcaster. The next moment, the entire station was filled with screams. People began to disappear one by one. Some were absorbed into the walls. Some were captured in images. And some were left with only their voices. The scene suddenly ended. Ethan was standing in the archive room again. The broadcaster was still in front of him. But now Ethan felt this creature was not born of evil. It had once been an ordinary human being. Suddenly Samuel's voice came from behind. "Ethan." He came running back. He had an old book in his hand. "I found this." Ethan opened the book. On the first page it was written, "Transmission Protocol 313. A note was written below. "If the door opens, the person whose voice will be the last to be heard will be the one who will sacrifice himself to close it." Ethan fell silent. "What does that mean?" Samuel replied slowly. "What does that mean? This time the last voice is yours." Ethan took a step back involuntarily. No, there must be another way. At that moment, the entire station began to shake violently. Dust began to fall from the ceiling. All the radios turned on at once. The same sentence was heard from each speaker. "The broadcast is about to end." Suddenly, a secret door opened in the wall of the archive room. Inside it were stairs leading down. A blue light was shining at the end of the stairs. Samuel said fearfully, "This is where the real transmitter is located. If you don't turn it off, then tonight these broadcasts won't just reach the city, but the whole world." Ethan took a deep breath. He gripped the flashlight tightly and slowly started walking towards the stairs. But as he took the first step, hundreds of people whispered together from below, "Welcome, the last host. Welcome, the last host." This voice was not that of one person. It seemed as if hundreds of people were speaking at once. Ethan held the flashlight tightly and slowly began to descend the stairs. The blue light was getting brighter with each step. After a few moments, he arrived at a huge underground hall. The hall was circular. There were countless wires on the walls, all connected to a huge machine. That was the original transmitter, but it didn't look like an ordinary machine. Its metal was breathing. The wires vibrated as if they were alive. And in the middle of it, a blue glowing circle was constantly rotating. Every few seconds, radio waves would come out of it. "SHHHH," Samuel said in a low voice. "This is the machine that opened the door to the other world." Suddenly, the old speakers in the entire hall turned on at once. The audience is growing. The broadcast is about to spread worldwide. The last host has taken his place. Ethan said angrily, "I will never be a part of this broadcast." At that moment, the waves in the blue circle began to accelerate. Faces slowly began to form within the glowing light. Dozens, then hundreds. Each face was frightened. Some had their eyes closed, some were reaching out for help. A woman was banging on the glass loudly. A child was crying. Samuel lowered his eyes. These are all people whose souls are imprisoned. Ethan moved closer and looked. Suddenly, his breath stopped. Among these faces, he saw a familiar face. It was himself, exactly like him. The imprisoned Ethan shouted from behind the glass, "Don't come near. It'll imprison you too." Ethan stepped back in surprise. "How is that possible?" Samuel said softly, "This is your future. Or maybe another reality." At that moment, the broadcaster appeared from the other end of the hall. The floor trembled with every step he took. He stood directly in front of the transmitter. A clear voice came from his radio-like face. "Every broadcast needs a voice. Today, your voice." Suddenly, an old microphone emerged from the ground in the middle of the hall. A red light began to flash around it. Samuel shouted, "Don't go near it." But as he said this, a strange power emanated from the microphone. Ethan's body began to move against his will. He tried with all his might to stop himself, but his steps were automatically heading towards the microphone. "No!" he screamed, but it was no use. A few moments later, he was standing right in front of the microphone. The red light came on. Then an announcement came over the speaker. Recording started. At that moment, words began to come out of Ethan's mouth. But he wasn't speaking himself. Someone else was using his voice. I'm Ethan Carter. And I willingly, he was trying with all his might to be silent. Tears welled up in his eyes. "No," he screamed loudly. At that moment, sparks flew from the microphone. The broadcaster recoiled in pain for the first time. The entire hall began to shake. The blue sphere began to spin uncontrollably. Samuel was stunned. "Impossible. You broke its power." But the joy lasted only a few seconds. A red message appeared on the transmitter screen. "System failure. Emergency transmission activated." Then the machine's voice came. "If the main host refuses, then an alternate host will be selected." Suddenly, the entire hall was plunged into darkness. Only one light remained. That light was falling on Samuel. Fear spread across the old man's face. "No, not this time." But it was too late. Black wires emerged from the ground and wrapped around Samuel's body. He kept screaming, "Ethan, shut down the machine, or else." Before he could finish speaking, the wires lifted him into the air, pulled inside the blue circle. A moment later, Samuel had disappeared. Only his last scream echoed throughout the hall. And then, the broadcaster slowly turned his radio-like face towards Ethan for the first time. Only one word flashed on the screen of the word "next," flashing on the radio screen slowly turned red. The entire underground hall was shaking. The blue light coming from the transmitter was now starting to darken. Ethan stared at the place where Samuel had disappeared for a few moments. "No." His voice was trembling. "I won't leave you here." At that moment, Samuel's voice was heard from inside the transmitter. "Ethan, listen to me." The voice was very weak. "I'm still alive." But not for long. Ethan immediately approached the machine. Within the blue circle, he saw hundreds of faces. Samuel was among them all. He was like a prisoner behind a glass. He raised his hand and gestured. "Look behind the machine." Ethan immediately went to the back of the transmitter. There was a rusty iron door, which was not visible before. It was written in large letters. "Control room." A strange sign was carved under the door. There was only a button in the middle. Above it was written, "Final shutdown." Ethan reached out to press the button. But suddenly the broadcaster's voice rang out from behind. "If this button is pressed, then all the imprisoned souls will be gone forever." Ethan's hand stopped there. "What?" The broadcaster slowly approached him. For the first time, his voice was calm instead of angry. "You think I'm a monster? But I'm keeping them all alive. If the machine shuts down, then they will all be gone forever." Ethan looked at the blue circle. "Really?" Everyone there was looking at him expectantly. Then Samuel shouted loudly, "Don't listen to him. He's lying." The broadcaster started laughing quietly. "Lies." Suddenly, he raised his hand in the air. The entire hall began to change. A new scene appeared in front of Ethan. He was standing alone in his own house. His mother was smiling. His old dog was sitting at his feet. Everything seemed so real. His mother smiled and said, "Son, come back home." Tears welled up in Ethan's eyes. His mother had died many years ago. He moved towards her helplessly. But suddenly, he remembered Samuel's words. "This place plays on your fears and desires." Ethan stopped. He closed his eyes and screamed with all his might, "This is not real." The next moment, the entire scene shattered like glass. He was standing in the underground hall again. The broadcaster roared angrily for the first time. A terrifying noise began to come from the radio. SHHHHHH. All the walls began to tremble. The transmitter went out of control. Red sparks began to fly in all directions. At the same time, Ethan's eyes fell on an old file that had fallen on the floor. He immediately picked it up. It was Dr. Alan Morgan's last report. It read, "The broadcaster cannot be eliminated because he is no longer a human being. But if the source of the original frequency is destroyed, the door to the other world will be closed forever." Another sentence was written below. The source of the frequency is Jacob Harper's original microphone. Ethan immediately looked around the hall. A few steps away, an old microphone was placed in a glass case. The same microphone that Jacob had used to make his last broadcast. The broadcaster also noticed it. He rushed towards a microphone at full speed. Ethan also ran. They both reached the glass at almost the same time. The broadcaster raised his hand angrily. Ethan smashed the glass with all his strength.
Bang!
The glass broke. He picked up the microphone. At that moment, a huge explosion shook the entire hall. The broadcaster screamed in pain. His body began to turn into smoke. But he was not completely finished. He looked at Ethan one last time and said, "If you break it, then you will be imprisoned with me forever." Ethan gripped the microphone tightly. There were only two choices before him. Either save his own life, or free thousands of imprisoned souls. He took a deep breath, and raised his hand to slam the microphone to the ground with all his strength. Ethan held the microphone tightly with both hands. In front of him stood the broadcaster, whose body was disintegrating like smoke every moment, but his red eyes were still fixed on Ethan. "If you break this microphone," the broadcaster's heavy voice echoed, "then you will never be able to leave this place." Ethan looked at the blue circle. Hundreds of souls trapped inside it were silently watching him. Samuel was among them. He nodded slowly, as if saying, "This is the right time." Ethan closed his eyes. He began to remember all the moments of his life. His parents, his friends, and the promise he had always made to his audience. "I will always tell the truth, no matter what the cost." He took a deep breath and slammed the microphone to the ground with all his might.
Bang!
The microphone shattered into pieces. The next moment, the entire underground hall began to shake violently. A blue light shot up from the transmitter towards the sky. Cracks began to form in the walls. Screams echoed from all the speakers at once. The broadcaster let out a terrible scream of pain. His body began to turn into smoke. But this time, he could not reform. A few moments later, a crack appeared in his radio-like face. Then another. Then a third. And suddenly, he disappeared into the air, scattering into thousands of black particles. At that moment, all the souls trapped within the blue circle began to break free. Each soul was transforming into a shining light. For the first time, the hall felt calm instead of fear. Samuel's soul stopped in front of Ethan. He didn't look old anymore. There was a satisfaction on his face. "You set us free, Ethan." Tears welled up in Ethan's eyes. "I wish I could save you too." Samuel smiled. "Some sacrifices can't be taken back. But today we are all free." Saying this, he too transformed into light. A few moments later, the entire hall was empty. But suddenly, there was a loud explosion. The transmitter began to explode. Ethan immediately started running. Stairs, corridors, broken rooms. Now all the paths had returned to their original form. Large pieces of the roof were falling. He ran at full speed. Finally, he saw the exit. As soon as he stepped out, the entire radio station behind him collapsed. A huge cloud of dust rose into the sky. The first rays of dawn were appearing. Ethan sat down on the grass. His body was bruised, but he was alive. He turned around and looked where Double 313 had once stood. Now, there was only rubble. 3 months later, Ethan released all his recordings to the world. People thought they were a fantastic horror story. No one believed it was all real. The government even sealed off the place. A few months later, a new forest began to grow there. It was as if no building had ever existed there. Ethan also decided that he would never talk about the incident again. He thought everything was over. But one night, at exactly 3:13 a.m., the old radio in his bedroom, which had been broken for years, suddenly turned on by itself.
Shit.
Ethan sat up in shock. Then a familiar voice came from the radio. "This is WCR 313. Welcome to today's special broadcast." Ethan's face flushed, because this voice was not the broadcaster's. It was Samuel's. After a few moments, the radio went silent, and only one sentence appeared on his screen. "Transmission never ends. The end."